The Danish West Indies, a trio of lush islands nestled in the Caribbean Sea, St. Thomas, St. John, and St. Croix, served as both a paradise and a battleground for colonial ambitions. Their strategic location, just a stone's throw from the lucrative trade routes of the Caribbean, made them prized possessions. From the early 17th century, Denmark recognized this potential and established control, determined to carve out a piece of the profitable sugar trade. In 1671, Denmark formally took possession of St. Thomas, followed by St. John in 1718 and St. Croix in 1733. The islands thrived under Danish rule, but the wealth they generated came with a dark side. Sugar became the lifeblood of these colonies, flourishing through the backbreaking labor of enslaved Africans. By the 18th century, sugar plantations dotted the landscape, each fueled by the suffering and toil of thousands. Records show that at its height, the slave population in the Danish West Indies outnumbered free residents by a staggering margin. Under Danish colonial control, the island's economy surged. Sugar production skyrocketed, with exports reaching unprecedented levels. But this boom wasn't built on equality or fair labor practices. It relied heavily on an oppressive system of enslavement. Slave ships packed with captives arrived on the islands, their holds filled with humanity, stripped of freedom, families torn apart for profit. The plantation owners, driven by human greed, amassed great fortunes, while the enslaved toiled in inhumane conditions. The islands became notorious for their brutal work environments, and countless lives were lost to exhaustion and violence. As the 19th century unfolded, the tide began to turn. Abolition movements gained momentum across the globe, challenging the very foundations of the slave-driven economy. The Danish government, under pressure, began to take steps toward ending slavery. In 1848, after years of unrest and rebellion, enslaved people on St. Croix rose up, leading to the abolition of slavery in the Danish West Indies. The end of slavery did not equate to freedom. Instead, it ushered in a new era of economic struggles and social unrest. Former slaves faced systemic discrimination, landlessness, and continued exploitation as the remnants of the colonial system persisted. Though the islands transitioned to a free society, the economic strains remained palpable. The once mighty sugar industry faltered in the late 19th century, facing intense competition from other Caribbean producers and the onset of industrialization. By the turn of the 20th century, the islands were economically vulnerable. As World War I loomed, Denmark faced mounting pressure. The strategic importance of the islands didn't go unnoticed. The United States, eager to bolster its Caribbean presence and protect its interests, turned its gaze toward the Danish West Indies. In 1917, a secret negotiation unfolded, leading to a shocking revelation. The United States, under President Woodrow Wilson, was set to buy the islands for $25 million. This sale was not just a transaction. It was a calculated move to secure a foothold in the Caribbean and protect the Panama Canal. But behind this financial decision lay a complex web of human ambition and betrayal. Many locals felt abandoned by a colonial power that prioritized profit over people. What was the true cost of this transaction? How would the inhabitants react to their new masters? The story of the Danish West Indies was just beginning to take a dramatic turn, raising pivotal questions about loyalty, identity, and the legacies of slavery. With this purchase, the islands would forever change hands, but at what price to the people who called them home? As World War I raged across Europe, colonial powers faced mounting pressures, economies strained under the weight of war efforts. For Denmark, the Danish West Indies, comprising the islands of St. Thomas, St. John, and St. Croix, represented both a profitable past and a challenging present. The shift from a thriving sugar economy fueled by enslaved labor to a system grappling with the ramifications of abolition in 1848 left Denmark struggling. With burgeoning unrest and economic decline, maintaining control over these islands became a burden. Meanwhile, the United States eyed the Caribbean with increasing interest. The war had magnified the need for strategic military footholds. Control over the Danish West Indies could provide the U.S. with a vital base to secure shipping routes and protect its interests in Central and South America. With European powers distracted by conflict, the U.S. saw an opening. The American public was largely indifferent to these remote islands. Yet, influential politicians recognized their strategic importance. Secretary of State Robert Lansing argued that acquiring the islands would bolster national security as battles raged in Europe. Economic considerations loomed large too. Possessing the islands could offer trade advantages within the Caribbean. Denmark's ambitions were hampered by its struggles. The islands had economic value, but dwindling sugar prices and a tumultuous post-abolition society strained Denmark's ability to sustain its colonial investments. Local populations, yearning for more autonomy, saw their discontent grow. The shift from a slave-driven economy meant that newly freed individuals faced unemployment and poverty, stirring unrest and demands for greater rights. In this volatile context, talks began. The U.S. proposal emerged from a mix of opportunism and necessity. In early 1917, the U.S. offered $25 million for the Danish West Indies. The revelation sent shockwaves through the islands. Locals wondered what life would be like under a new colonial administration. Would it be a mere continuation of exploitation under a different flag? For Denmark, the deal was appealing. The financial crisis compounded by the war, coupled with fears of German expansion in the Caribbean, pressured officials to consider the sale seriously. By selling the islands, Denmark could secure funds to stabilize its economy back home and alleviate the burden of managing distant territories. Negotiations progressed, but the islanders remained largely uninformed about their future. Whispers of betrayal echoed through the streets of St. Thomas. Who would truly benefit from this transaction? Would life improve, or would it plunge them into deeper uncertainty? In March 1917, the Danish parliament ratified the sale. As the ink dried on the treaty, many islanders braced for change, while others grimly accepted their fate. Questions surfaced. What new authority would rule them? How would their daily lives be impacted under American governance? The uncertainty was palpable. With the conclusion of the sale looming, another layer of complexity emerged. Just as the details were finalized, events in Europe would alter the landscape once again. Not far from the Caribbean, the United States was ramping up its military involvement in World War I. What unforeseen consequences would this war have on the fate of the islands and their residents? Would their new American rulers prioritize strategic interests over local needs? As alliances shifted and tensions escalated, one crucial question lingered. Was the purchase merely a strategic maneuver, or would it ignite further conflicts in the Caribbean? What awaited the islands before they even became American? The answers lay just beyond the horizon. As the drums of World War I thundered in Europe, an undercurrent of strategic tension flowed through the Caribbean. Germany's Kaiser, Wilhelm II, eyed the Danish West Indies with covetous ambition, contemplating the establishment of a naval base on the islands. Control of these strategic points meant more than just military might. It signaled an extension of influence in the Western Hemisphere, a critical factor in the midst of global conflict. For the United States, the looming threat of Kaiser Wilhelm's ambitions transformed a distant concern into an urgent priority. The U.S. government, under President Woodrow Wilson, recognized that possessing the Danish West Indies could thwart any German plans in the region. The islands, with their proximity to vital shipping routes, presented an opportunity to enhance American security and military readiness. Thus, negotiations commenced, set against a tapestry of colonial ambitions and underlying tensions. In early 1917, the U.S. made its interest clear. A proposal circulated, $25 million for the islands. But how did they arrive at this figure? This wasn't just a random sum struck in the heat of negotiation. It reflected a deeper historical context. The islands had been struggling since the abolition of slavery in 1848, facing economic decline as the once thriving sugar industry floundered. The declining market left Denmark hard-pressed, continuously pouring money into the islands to maintain order amidst growing local unrest. The $25 million wasn't merely a price tag, it was also an admission of Denmark's capitulation to the financial realities of its colonial holdings. Yet, the proposed sale triggered a whirlpool of emotions. For Danish lawmakers, it was a pragmatic decision. They grappled with the bitter truth that maintaining control was increasingly untenable. But for the islanders, the sale felt like a betrayal. Here they were, living on lands steeped in history and struggle, suddenly thrust into the mercenary whims of foreign powers whose interests were far removed from their own. As negotiations wore on, whispers of dissent grew louder among the inhabitants of the islands. What would this mean for their identity, their autonomy, their futures? Would they be absorbed into the American fabric, or would their needs be overshadowed by strategic military concerns? The islands were not merely real estate, they were home. Despite the U.S. insistence that American governance would usher in prosperity and stability, voices of skepticism flourished. The fear was palpable. Would American forces prioritize their security over the island's cultural and economic needs? The question echoed through the air, unanswered, as the Danish parliament ratified the sale in March 1917. Yet beneath the surface of this seemingly straightforward acquisition lay a web of anxiety, economic calculations, and the heavy shadow of colonial exploitation. The U.S. moved swiftly, but the consequences of colonial ambitions were never black and white. The sale was framed as a strategic gain, but was it merely another chapter in a long history of exploitation? As the ink dried on the agreement, a more profound question loomed. Would the people of the Danish West Indies be able to forge their own destiny under a new banner, or would they remain forever trapped between the desires of European powers and the ambitions of their new American overseers? As the Caribbean winds shifted, nations watched with bated breath. The story is far from over, and the real impact of this sale is yet to unfold. What would the future hold for those islands and their inhabitants under American rule? As the dust settled from the sale, the immediate aftermath marked a seismic shift in governance. On March 31, 1917, the Danish flag was lowered for the last time, giving way to the American stars and stripes fluttering in the Caribbean breeze. The United States took immediate control. Reforms began streaming in, altering the very fabric of life for the islanders. American law was enforced. The islands became strategic outposts, not places of community. Local governance faced drastic changes. The U.S. appointed a governor with sweeping powers, much to the chagrin of residents who had hoped for some degree of self-rule. Instead, they found themselves navigating a new bureaucracy, where their voices were often drowned out. Decisions were made hundreds of miles away in Washington, D.C., without consultation from the people most affected. Skepticism of the American intentions ran deep as islanders witnessed the iron-fisted approach of foreign rule. Many felt abandoned by Denmark and betrayed by their new overlords. Economic consequences soon rippled across the islands. The once vibrant agricultural economy, heavily reliant on sugar, began to wane. American interests sought to maximize profit at the expense of local livelihood. New systems solidified, focusing on cash crops for export rather than local sustenance. The islands were treated as commodities themselves, merely a means to bolster U.S. military and economic power in a world still reeling from the Great War. Yet, the local population bore the brunt of these shifts. As American companies moved in, jobs were created, but often at a cost. Labor was poorly paid, working conditions were dire, and the promise of prosperity felt like a cruel illusion. Discontent simmered beneath the surface. The idyllic paradise many had hoped to maintain morphed into a battleground of struggle against American imperialism. Culturally, the islands faced a profound identity crisis. American influence permeated every facet of life. English replaced Danish as the dominant language in schools and public life. The cultural tapestry began to unravel, and traditions faded as the new regime emphasized American customs. Residents feared the erasure of their heritage. Would they become mere ghosts within their own history? The geopolitical consequences of American control grew ever more complex. The Caribbean transformed into a strategic base for American interests, especially during World War II and the ensuing Cold War. The islands became vital for military logistics, allowing the U.S. to project power in the hemisphere and beyond. Yet, with this military strategy came lingering resentment. The narrative of the islands shifted in global awareness, from a quaint locale to a pawn in the grand chess game of international conflict. As American dominance tightened, the legacy of the sale haunted every decision and every resident. Much like the waves crashing against the shores, a tension built beneath the surface. Was this the price of security or merely a new form of colonial exploitation? The once glimmering hope of self-determination lay tangled within the paradox of American promises and the brutal reality of control. And as the islanders grappled with these new realities, one question loomed large. How would they respond to the undeniable patterns of betrayal and greed that shaped their fate? Would they rise to reclaim their identity, or would they be forever lost to the tides of foreign ambition?